Casting a realistic silicone foot. Now, this particular video was inspired by a YouTube comment. One of you commented on an older video I had on casting a foot for my daughter, and you were asking about air bubbles and how to avoid those and that sort of thing. So, since I had recently made another foot for my youngest daughter, I thought this might be a great time to go over some of those basics and explain some good tips for avoiding air bubbles and how to patch them when they occur. Now, for starters, we're going to prepare a cardboard box as a mold box for this mold. Now, I already have a lot of material on life casting, so at the end screen, I'll link to some of the previous tutorials I've done, like this one about casting hands using 5110F and 5130F, and I'll also link to a playlist of all our life casting videos, so be sure to check that out. And what I'm doing here is just lining the inside of a cardboard box that's roughly a little bit larger than my daughter's foot with clear packing tape. And what that does is that's going to prevent the wet alginate from soaking into the cardboard box. And typically when you're making an alginate mold like this, it's going to degrade. Alginate is biodegradable, so we want to make sure that we have a cardboard box that will hold up well enough for that mold, but obviously it doesn't need to be permanent. And here I'm just dispensing just some general purpose alginate off the internets into a bucket. And one of the important details here, again, I don't want to get too far into the life casting portion because I already have a ton of videos on this. So here, one of the key things to remember is always a good idea to pour your water into the alginate rather than the alginate into water. And the reason for that is alginate is a very low density powder and it has a tendency to float on the water. So you wind up wasting valuable time trying to get the powdered alginate down to the bottom. So alginate typically being a fairly fast setting material, we want to make sure we get the most out of our time. So here I'm just using a drill to mix that up and then pour that into my cardboard box. And then I'm ready to make my mold. And this is where, again, most alginate formulas, this is about a 5-minute formula. Most are fairly fast. So you want to make sure you keep track of time because when it sets up and it sets up fast. Now, there are two ways you can mold a foot using a box like this. One is to suspend your subject's foot in the middle of the box, not touching any of the sides or the bottom. And that's ideal for creating a prop foot or, for medical simulators and that sort of thing. But if you're molding a foot to make a shoe last or a form for making custom footwear later on, then it's a good idea to have your subject press their foot against the bottom of the box and ideally stand up while they're having their foot molded. And that way you get the shape of their foot under a load. So a weight-bearing foot is different than a foot that's just free-floating in a box. So real important detail, real important to understand exactly what you want to do with this finished cast. So here my daughter wanted to play around with making some custom things around her foot, so we went for the latter of those two approaches. Now, once our alginate mold has set up, I carefully peel away any of the cured alginate from around her ankle. And the reason for that is if we just start pulling her foot out right now, some of that scrap alginate could fall down into the mold and mess up our cast later on. So real important to carefully peel away any of the alginate up around your subject's ankle before you start removing the mold. And depending on the size of their foot and the way the mold is configured, your mold might tear slightly as they remove their foot, and that's okay. Typically that goes right back together. And depending on what you're going to be using the finished foot for, typically that's pretty easy to clean up. Here we have a very small tear that we'll be patching up later on in the finished foot. Now, for our cast, this is really important. For this, my daughter wanted a soft, fairly lifelike foot to work with, so we're using TC5110F Platinum Silicone. Now, one of the most important things about this is it is low viscosity, a very low 2500 centipoise mixed viscosity, and very soft like human skin. This is also translucent, easy to pigment, and fast setting. Fast setting is really important for this because we want to get a good copy out of this mold before it starts to distort, because an alginate mold will shrink and distort as it ages. So you want to make sure you get your cast quickly. A slow setting silicone is one of the worst things you can use in a mold like this. Also, this is a fairly cost-effective formula, and as you'll see here in just a minute, really important that it can be thickened with the SC5001 thickening agent. And we'll be using that later on at the end of the video to thicken up a small batch of silicone to patch any of the little air bubbles on the toes. Now ready to mix and pour our silicone. Now, real important to remember that an alginate mold is time sensitive. So another reason why you want to move fast, as soon as you get your mold made, you want to be ready to cast into that finished mold. If you wait too long, that mold will start to shrink and distort, and you'll get horrible results. So make sure you're ready to mix and pour your silicone as soon as you demold your alginate mold from your subject. Now, 5110F is a fast formula that's mixed 1-to-1 by weight or volume. And here I'm going to pigment it with some flesh-toned silicone pigment and also a little bit of flocking. And this, again, we didn't have to do this, but for the sake of the video, I did want this to look somewhat realistic. So we're adding a little bit of the light flesh tone, and then a little bit of the flesh tone flocking and the red flocking. And you'll find that adding red flocking to silicone when you're casting like this, at a minimum, just adding a pinch of that red flocking really helps with the realism and gives you a much more realistic, lifelike cast silicone. Now, also, really important to remember the working time of your silicone formula. 5110F is a fast setting formula, has a 7 to 8 minute working time and about an hour demold time at room temperature. And really important also to remember that temperature can affect the set of silicone. So working in a cold area will slow it down, and a hot area will speed it up. And you never want to be working below about 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If you get below 65, that's going to start retarding the cure of the silicone, and again, you're going to wind up with other problems from that. Now, if you don't have the capability to vacuum degas, it's not the end of the world. You can pour this as is, but you're probably going to wind up with more air bubbles. And one little trick you can do is actually let the silicone sit for a few minutes before you pour, and that will allow it to naturally de-air a little bit. But ideally, under ideal circumstances, when you're casting silicone, you want to subject that to a vacuum. And then what that will do is pull all of the air bubbles out that you introduced in the process of mixing, and then you'll be ready to pour a nice bubble-free copy. Now, when you degas silicone and pour it into a mold like this, that doesn't guarantee a bubble-free surface. What that means is now you have no bubbles inside the silicone. So you can still wind up with bubbles entrapped in areas like knuckles or toes and things like that, where there's a void from the way the silicone is poured. And you'll see that here in just a minute. But for a foot, this is also a really important detail for a foot, because unlike a hand, we don't have a straight down pour. So what we need to do is pour this mold partially full, and then what I'm going to do is tilt the mold upright to allow the air to kind of burp out of those toes, and then gradually fill it up as I set the mold down level again on my work surface. Now remember, our silicone that we're using, the 5110F, has a demold time of about an hour, and that's an hour at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm going to go ahead and let this sit a little bit longer than that, because the alginate is a little bit on the cool side, and that might have a tendency to slow it down a little bit. So I let this sit for about an hour and a half. And first I'm peeling off the little overflow that came out the top. And that's a good way to test that, make sure it has handling strength before I demold that and accidentally mess up the toes or something. But you see that silicone has a really nice high elongation, really high tear strength. And now we are ready to carefully demold our foot. And I say carefully, we could just tear the alginate mold off that foot. That would not hurt anything at all. But in some cases, we can get multiple pulls out of a mold like this. In fact, for this mold, I was actually able to get a few different feet casts out of this mold. So if you're careful with a mold like this, you can get more than one cast. Just remember that an alginate mold is temporary, so you need to get your casting done in about 2 or 3 hours or so before that mold starts to distort. And now we're ready to patch that air bubble in that second toe. And we're going to do that with another batch of silicone. This is more 5110F. And I just put a few drops of the SC 5001 thickening agent in it to thicken that to a paste. Typically about 1% is more than enough to get a really nice thick paste. And we're going to use that to patch that air bubble using a dental tool and a tongue depressor. Now, whenever you're patching air bubbles like this or painting a finished silicone cast, it's always a good idea to do that as soon as possible, and ideally use the same silicone used in the casting process. So here is a small batch of additional TC5110F platinum silicone, thickened with SC5001 thickening agent, and I mixed about 1% thickener into that to get a really nice thick paste. And that consistency is perfect for filling in air bubbles and patching seams and that sort of thing. And this is another one of those processes that just takes practice. You just got to do a lot of this. The more you do, the better you'll get at it. And this is a good reason to also save your bad casts and play with those and get used to working the seams on those and fixing any areas. Here's the little area that had that rip where we pulled the foot out of the silicone when my daughter's foot came out. It tore it just a little bit, so now I'm adding a little bit additional silicone there to correct that little deformity there where it ripped. Now, the silicone here that I'm using to patch, of course, this being also more 5110F, this will cure in about an hour, and we could speed that up with heat. So in about an hour, that will be ready to paint if we are so inclined. And of course, for painting, I typically use either silicone sealant or more 5110F, if that's the material used in the cast. Now we're going to see if my daughter can create a proper YouTube reaction to her silicone foot, and of course there she goes, knocks it out of the park, and there you have a silicone foot cast in 5110F platinum silicone. Now, as always, all of the material links will be in the video description, so be sure to check those out. And of course, on the end screen here, be sure to check out the additional tutorials on casting silicone hands, and of course painting those hands with additional 5110F. And on the bottom right, I have a playlist linked for tutorials on life casting, so check that out as well. And as always, thanks for watching, and thanks for your support of the channel.